El ejército del Ebro, rumba, 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 la. El ejército del Ebro, rumba, 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 la. Una noche el río pasó, ay Carmela, ay Carmela. Una noche el río pasó, ay Carmela, ay Carmela. Pero nada pueden bombas, rumba, la, rumba, la, rumba, la. Pero nada pueden bombas, rumba, la, rumba, la, rumba, la. Donde sobra corazón, ay Carmela.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. My name is Michael Livingston, and I'm with Socialist Action. To my left is Kieran Knutson, who is with the anarchist Michigan-Minnesota group, and to my right is John Peterson with the Workers International League. Where they're sitting has nothing to do with their political perspectives. Our plan is for each of us to speak for about 15 minutes. I will give an overview and try to explain why I think the Spanish Revolution is so important. Kieran will speak next and talk about the role of the anarchists in the Spanish Revolution. And finally, John will speak about the Trotskyists in the Spanish Revolution. And then we hope to have 45 minutes of discussion and question and answer. So I hope this will be a very lively evening. 70 years ago this month in Barcelona, the last of the international brigades left the Second Republic. This was essentially the acknowledgement by the Second Republic that they had lost the war. And in fact, they had lost the war. By January, Barcelona had fallen, and by March, Madrid also surrendered. And in April 1st of 1939, Franco declared complete victory in Spain, and his government was recognized by the United States, and it was no April Fool's joke. Why is this revolution so important? Well, if we look around us, anyone who's awake will know that we seem to be going at breakneck speed towards disaster. We have global warming that threatens the very existence of life on Earth. We have massive extinctions. We have the buildup of carcinogenic chemicals in our bodies and in the environment. We have wars breaking out all over. The United States is fighting two clear wars, one in Iraq, the other in Afghanistan, and possibly a half war in Pakistan. We have civil wars breaking out in Latin America and in Africa, and we have the collapse of our economic system on a global scale. So anybody who's awake has a lot of reason to be concerned, and there's a lot of reason to despair. Now, many of us in this room, I think, are not despondent. We're not despairing, and the reason is because we believe that another world is possible. Or as they say in Spanish, otro mundo es posible. We believe that, and that gives us strength, but we're still faced with a very difficult question. How do we get from here to there? And when we address the question, how do we get from here to there, the example of the Spanish Revolution is very instructive and is worth our paying attention to, both for their heroic inspiration, for the things they did correctly, and for their mistakes. So that's why we need to pay attention to this revolution. It is a very important revolution, and it can help us build our own revolution in this country and planet-wide, a revolution that I would argue we desperately need. Let me back up and give you some context. And the context begins in 1492. 1492 saw the consolidation of the Spanish state under Ferdinand and Isabel. It was a state dedicated to mercantile capitalism, making of profits through trade, and what Marx called primitive accumulation, which means they stole it. Now, who did they steal it from? Well, they stole it, of course, from the Spanish peasants, but they mostly stole it from the indigenous peoples of the New World. 1492 saw the opening up of the New World to capitalist exploitation by Columbus. The same year saw the invasion of the Kingdom of Granada by Ferdinand and Isabel, breaking a century-old peace treaty unilaterally and crushing the last Arab kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. And it also saw, in 1492, the expulsion of the Jews who threatened the ruling class's power because they were an educated middle class, and the beginning of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, the Spanish Inquisition had really nothing to do with religion, except for the fact that the Catholic Church was deeply in bed with the Spanish ruling class. It was mostly about political control and power. So, they had asset forfeiture. So if someone said you were a secret Jew, they would seize your assets. They would torture you until you confessed, and if you died under torture, then they would burn you in effigy. And then after you confessed, then they would burn you, if you lived. So really it was a massive consolidation of wealth in the Spanish ruling class, and they used it to fuel their colonial expansion and used it to pay for the instruments, the military and ships needed to extract raw materials from the New World and to enslave the indigenous people. Now, Spain was the first great capitalist empire based on mercantile capitalism. And it started to decline in the early 1800s when, in fact, other countries started to emerge, and you saw the development of first agrarian capitalism in England, and then finally industrial capitalism in England and France and Belgium. So you have competing imperial powers emerging, and you have a wave of liberation movements throughout Latin America in the 1820s that dismembers most of the Spanish Empire, but not all of it. The final dismemberment of the Spanish Empire occurs in 1898 in the Spanish-American War, where the emerging capitalist power, industrial capitalism, the emerging capitalist power of the United States seizes the remaining colonies of Spain, which included Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and the Philippines. Now, this was a shock to the ruling class of Spain, and they never fully recovered from it. In World War I, the Spanish stayed neutral, and as a consequence, they experienced a very rapid rate of economic growth. They were essentially selling food and industrial goods to both sides. This period of economic expansion in Spain collapses, however, with the Great Depression in 1929. So now you have in Spain a fairly large working class as a consequence of the industrialization, under a repressive monarchy and a political dictatorship, the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera. Now, there are a couple other elements here that are important, so let me just back up into the 19-teens. One is that Spain was a very unique country because the working class developed strongly under the influence of both socialism and anarchism. So starting in the 1860s and really getting going around the turn of the century and at the time of the First World War, you see the emergence of a very, very strong socialist movement and a very, very strong anarchist movement. And both of these movements had deep roots within the working class, and they had large labor union federations. Under the influence of the Russian Revolution, a number of the anarchists and a number of the socialists became communists. And with the degeneration of Russia in the 1920s, those anarchists and socialists who had become communists leave the Stalinist communist parties and either return to the anarchist movement or join the Trotskyist movement in 1930. So we have a very unique situation of a country that's collapsing. The dictatorship collapses in 1930, and then you have a very, very strong working class that's probably the most revolutionary working class in Europe and has strong anarchist and Trotskyist influences. Okay. With the fall of the dictator Primo de Rivera, a new period of political instability opens up, and the political instability is characterized by really two different elements here. One is that the ruling class keeps having to cycle through lots of governments. So they'll have a government, the government will collapse, they try to get a new government in power. The second thing that happens is that really a process of revolution starts taking place, and there's lots of dual power. Communes arise, general strikes occur. The working class is really trying to take direct control of the economy and the political process, while the ruling class keeps having to shuffle through the power. In 1931, the Republicans, who are the people against the monarchy and the dictatorship, carry the municipal elections. In 31 also you have the founding of the Second Republic. And the first thing that the Second Republic does, this democratic government, is it crushes a general strike in Sevilla carried out by the workers. In 1932, the anarchist Federation organizes an uprising in Catalonia. Catalonia is the area around Barcelona. It is culturally distinct from the rest of Spain. It had been conquered by Ferdinand and Isabel and subordinated to them. It was the most industrialized and radical region of Spain, and the anarchists had very strong roots there, and they organized a regional uprising. The regional uprising fails, and in August there's a military coup, a right-wing military coup that also fails. 1933, there's another round of elections because the government keeps falling and falling all the time, so they have to have new elections. And 1933, the rightists gain in the elections, and then in September, the government falls again. So you have this constant collapse of the bourgeois governments. And in October of 33, you have the fascists forming in Madrid, the Phalange. In November, there are more elections. The rightists win, and the rightists win because the anarchist trade unionists essentially boycott the elections. That's the only reason they won. The first thing that they do in 1934 is the first thing that the Republicans do, the right-wing government, is they try to crush a strike wave that's taking place that's been organized by the anarchists. In October, there's a general strike and organized by both socialists, Trotskyists, and anarchists, and the government crushes it again. In October and November, the people of Asturias, a region of Spain, form a commune, develop their own autonomous workers' government, and that is again crushed by the Republican government. This time, the military operation was led by one of the Spanish generals, Francisco Franco. Okay. In 1935, the Trotskyists formed their own political party, the POM, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. This brings all the revolutionary Marxists, all the Trotskyists together in Spain. And in 36, the government falls again in January, and in February you have the Popular Front government. Now, what is the Popular Front government? The Popular Front government was a coalition of the Communist Party, the conservative socialists, and the ruling class capitalists of Spain, who were not members of the Phalange, not fascists. The government was hell-bent on crushing the anarchists and the socialists and the Trotskyists and winning the Civil War. So the government was both fighting the fascists, and in July the fascists organized a military insurrection starting in Morocco, which was one of Spain's colonies. They crossed the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain, led by Franco. So the Republic was fighting the fascists on the one hand, and then they were fighting the own people on the other. So they were fighting the anarchists, they were fighting the Trotskyists, they were fighting the left socialists, and every time the workers tried to go on strike or organize a commune, they were essentially persecuted by the Republican government. So you have a civil war, but at the same time you have a revolution. So it's a three-way struggle. 36 is a very bad year. The Communist Party of Spain had been a minuscule political party, And it started to grow very rapidly because of Kremlin gold. Russia was one of the only countries that supported the Republic. The United States, Britain, and France refused to support the Republic. Italy and Germany supported the fascists. So the only real foreign ally was Russia, although Russia's support had strings attached to it. The strings were that the Communist Party of Spain got a lot of influence in the government, and the KGB got a lot of influence in the SIM, which was the military secret police. So the SIM, which was more or less managed by the KGB, starts rounding up lots and lots of workers, lots of left political leaders, lots of trade unionists, tons of anarchists and Trotskyists and left socialists, and either throwing them in prison or torturing them and killing them. From that point on, from 36 on, really the civil wars and the revolution is downhill. The fascists continue to make substantial progress, and all the time that the fascists are making substantial progress, the Republican government is spending more time killing its own workers and left the anarchists and the Trotskyists than they are really fighting the fascists. In 37, the fascists bombed Guernica, which is in the Basque region. In May of 37, the Republic attacks the anarchists who have seized the Barcelona telephone exchange. Again, another instance where the Republic attacks their own people. In June, the Republic outlaws the POM, arrests its leaders and kills them. And then in 38, you have essentially the collapse of the Republic. You have the siege of Madrid, the bombardment of Barcelona, and the departure of the international brigades in November, which really signals the end. Okay, so this is a very brief overview, and I just want to add one thing, and that is that the anarchists and Trotskyists and even some of the left socialists who were fighting for the Spanish Revolution against the fascists, but also at times against their own government, realized that they were fighting kind of a threefold struggle. They all were very, very aware that they were fighting against fascism, and they were fighting against the rise of fascism in Europe. They also knew that they were fighting for libertarian socialism, not the socialism that had come to be about in the Soviet Union, but a new, more free, more authentic socialism. So they knew they were fighting against fascism, they knew they were fighting for socialism, and they also knew that they were fighting to reinvigorate the revolutionary movement, a movement which they felt had gone into crisis because of the misleadership of the Stalinized Communist Party in the Soviet Union. So they were very serious people, they were very heroic people, they were fighting this triple struggle, and the world would have been a very different place had they won. So.
Thank you. My name is Kieran, and I'm in a small anarchist group, a new one called the Michigan-Minnesota group. And I'm also a member of the Industrial Workers of the World and of the Communication Workers of America, though of course I'm not speaking for either of those two groups right now. I want to thank Michael and Socialist Action for inviting me to speak, and Mayday Books for hosting it, and also John Peterson, who I just met tonight for the first time, for participating in it also. Shows a very good non-sectarian spirit, I think, that I appreciate, and I'll try and speak in those terms too. I also want to thank all the people locally in the IWW and in the anarchist movement broadly who keep anarchism on the map, and I think that's probably another reason why people are interested in hearing the anarchist viewpoint, is not just because of what happened in Spain, but what continues to happen, at least on a consistent low level in the Twin Cities too. So I just wanted to start off by talking a little bit about how I came to find out about the Spanish Revolution and why it became such an important piece of my political development. Anybody who knows me knows I come out of a left-wing family. My parents were both involved in the anti-war movement and supporting the civil rights movement, and out of that joined the Communist Party USA. And so I grew up in that environment, and constantly going to political meetings and like this one, or demonstrations and pickets. And as I became a teenager, I started to develop my own politics in a sense too. Like I wanted to be a participant on my own terms. And the first thing I did was join the Young Communist League, which was the Communist Party group of the Communist Party youth group. But I had a lot of friends at the same time that were getting influenced by anarchist punk. Punk was taking off in a big way at my high school. A lot of my friends were punks, and anarchism had a big, influence among them. So I wanted to try and figure out projects that I could work with them on. And one of the things I did was I went to visit one of Mayday Books' old places. There's the back part of it had a little part called the Backroom Anarchist Books. And so I went there and I found out a little bit about, I'd heard about the Spanish Civil War, sort of this heroic episode in communist history. At least that's how I had heard it. And I got some stuff about Spain. The first thing I thought, well, this is perfect, because this was a situation where communists and anarchists worked together, and this is what I want to do. So I picked up a book that I think Craig has some copies of here called Lessons of the Spanish Revolution by Vernon Richards. And that really helped me think about things in a lot of different ways, about what socialism really was, about what kind of revolution I was interested in fighting for, and coupled with stuff that was going on in Poland and in Afghanistan and in Austin, Minnesota, the P9 strike, influenced the way how I saw what kind of revolution I wanted to be of, and made me decide to call myself an anarchist and organize in that way. So I've been doing that since. So I want to talk about the anarchists here. That's what I was brought here for. Everyone can see this. There's a lot of little initials and stuff, and unless you've read a lot of this stuff, I know sometimes initials can just fly by. But in terms of the anarchists, the big three initials to know is the CNT, which was in Catalan or Spanish was the National Confederation of Labor. And they used the symbol, the red and black flag. People have probably seen that cut diagonally. And it became an extremely big and powerful force within Spain and within the Spanish working class. Before the Civil War, it grew to about 1.5 million members, and its members had tended to recruit the most radical, the poorest sections of the working class, the most revolutionary workers, those that wanted a revolution sooner rather than later, those that were very passionate about fighting. They organized both in the industrial sections of Spain, which was centered in Barcelona and Catalonia, but also amongst the poor peasants and lots of other places in Aragon and Valencia and Andalusia, and they grew to be a very strong force. Within the CNT, there was different competing tendencies, but anarchism ended up being the majority tendency for a long time. And at different points, while there was competition over what the nature of the CNT would be, anarchists organized what they called the FAI, which is up there too, which was an anarchist federation. And it was basically a loose federation of affinity groups. Affinity groups are basically groups of people who are friends with each other, who work together, who are part of the same community and do politics together on an ongoing basis. And the FAI was like a federation of those types of affinity groups. Almost all of them were also members of the CNT in all the different kinds of workplaces. And so they fought to keep the CNT on a revolutionary basis. And like Michael mentioned, the CNT was a leading force in countless numbers of general strikes. At different times, the Spanish capitalists tried to basically physically eliminate the CNT from the scene, and the FAI formed the groups, the defense guard that took on the pistoleros, that took on the death squads, and basically when workers got killed or organizers got killed, they'd go and return the favor. And so these are the kind of people that joined the CNT. It was sort of like the most militant, the most radical, the people that wanted to see a revolution happen and were constantly organizing for it. They had ateneos, which were sort of like storefront, I don't know if I said the word right, but storefront cultural centers and schools, the affinity groups, all kinds of publications. And the CNT was the main area the anarchists were active. There were two other groups I want to just basically say something quick about, which was the FIJL, which was the youth organization. This, again, as you can imagine, the young people from this scene were probably even more militant than their mothers and fathers in the CNT and the FAI, and they were organized, all the teenagers and people in their young 20s. They were organized in similar types of groups. And then another organization that deserves mention as well was the Mujeres Libres, which was an autonomous women's organization. Not something that the CNT decided to set up because they wanted to help women, but something that the anarchist women decided that needed to happen, needed to be done in order for full emancipation. And it quickly grew to be, have tens of thousands of members as well. So the situation in Spain, as Michael described it, was one of this, sort of teetering power and these different instances of dual power jumping up and different sort of failed attempts to launch revolutions that got crushed. And so things were always constantly teetering on this, and you have this mass union that has defense guards in all of its major industrial centers, its workplaces, and its peasant villages where it has influence. And so they're constantly on the ready. The idea that revolution is going to happen is like something that people are very conscious of, and many of them have participated in efforts to even bring it about. And so when the fascists rise up, when Franco launches his attack, people are already ready for it. Even for weeks before that, they had been campaigning to the Republic. And remember, the Republic was, a mixture of social democratic, socialist, and sort of just right-wing conservative, but democratic politicians. And the CNT's experience with it was that it was not all that much different than when the right wing was in power in terms of the repression it faced. But it was continually going to them saying, if we're going to defeat the fascists, you need to arm us. We have the forces, we have the organization, we can beat back this attempt to rise. Everyone knew that was on the agenda. And continually again, the Republic governments would refuse that demand, and as you can imagine why, it was because they saw that if the guns went to the workers, then there's no telling what the workers would do with them once the fascists were defeated. So when Franco and them rise up, though, the CNT goes into action, and they decide they can't wait for the guns. So they have a few guns that they've obtained through the years of building their own defense guards, but they go to the barracks where they can and seize them, to gun shops. They even raided a ship off of the Barcelona coast and took as many guns as they could. And heroically, it was the workers in the unions, and the CNT and the other mass union in Spain, the UGT, which was only slightly smaller than the Spanish CNT. And it was those groups that defeated. It was the unions that defeated Franco in that first hour. When I say defeated him, they didn't defeat the army, but they prevented the fascists from taking power in about 2/3 of Spain. And so that's the situation we find ourselves in, is where the Republic has basically refused or been very not decisive in standing up to Franco, and it's the workers themselves that have beat back Franco's attack. And so in that situation, it's very obvious what happens, at least to people like the CNT, people that had been preparing for and talking about revolution, who've been feeling the brunt of the attacks of the state for decades and decades, and that's that they took power as much as they could on the workplace. So even as they were fighting fascists in the streets of Barcelona, people in the transportation union, in the trains, in the mass transit, started taking over. Basically delegations of the union would step to the management and tell them they were all fired, that they were going to be taking power. So almost instantaneously, on the same day that the fascists were being fought, the unions, the CNT, moved to take over industry all over Spain. And so I want to read just one little thing, too, that had to go to what it looked like or what it felt like. And if people know about George Orwell, he was pretty famous, wrote 1984, An Animal Farm. And he wrote a good book people should take a look at if they get a chance, called Homage to Catalonia. In my opinion, he's not necessarily like this pure radical guy, but he's kind of like this aristocratic British guy with some good sympathies, and he lands right in the middle of it and sees what it felt like, what that revolution felt like. And I'll just read a couple things from that. It says, "The first time that I'd ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. Practically every building of any size had been seized by the workers and was draped with red flags and with the red and black flags of the anarchists. Every shop and cafe had an inscription saying that it had been collectivized. Even the bootblacks had been collectivized and their boxes painted red and black. Waiters and shop walkers looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Servile and even ceremonial forms of speech had temporarily disappeared. Nobody said señor or don or even used usted, the formal in Spanish. Everyone called everyone else comrade or thou and said salud instead of buenos dias." And he talks about just what that felt like to all the basically millions of people that were starting to feel this and participate in this. And so as this revolution is going on, a very deep revolution is going on in the grassroots level, there's another guy, a UPI reporter, an American, not particularly political either, but he gets caught up in it too. And he says that in many ways it was more profound than the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. the revolution he saw going on in front of him, the amount of collectivization that was going on. And again, I want to stress that what was going on was not that, you know, some political party had issued a decree that it was time for people, you know, that this industry was going to be nationalized and this industry was going to be nationalized. We'll form some commission. We'll send some experts down there to put it under, you know, socialism. This was the actual workers themselves in all of these industries organizing it themselves and taking over, firing their management, dismissing their management, and setting up industrial federations to tie them together. They weren't going for some nationalization of new bosses at the top, but they weren't going for their own little individual co-ops either. They're actually trying to create a society that could function on a mass scale that would be libertarian and would be under the control of the workers themselves. Let's see. So that's what the revolution felt like on the ground scale. Now, in many ways, I'd say that to the degree there was a Spanish Revolution, it was an anarchist revolution. To me, the CNT was the main force that sort of articulated the kind of revolution, the libertarian character of the revolution that was being carried out, and it was their membership that in so many ways was carrying it out. But saying that, I don't want to be just like getting bragging points, because I think what that means then is that the failure of the anarchist revolution also rests heavily on the anarchist shoulders as well. The revolution didn't succeed, and it faced a huge momentous, enemy. It faced this well-armed fascist army, an organized right-wing fascist cadre backed by the Catholic Church, but also, the combined support of Mussolini and Hitler, who were lending all kinds of, including their own soldiers, German and Italian soldiers, and airplanes bombing. So it was not an easy situation to be in. The other thing that was key about it was that the CNT, although it was extremely important, influential, and in my view, it organized the most radical workers, it didn't organize everybody. Like I said, about half of the Spanish working class was organized in a different union, in a union that looked to the Socialist Party as its main political inspiration. And then on top of that, you had different political forces in the middle class that were affiliated with different groups that wanted to independence for Catalonia and the Basque region. And then you had the Communist Party, which was the pro-Soviet Marxist party in Spain. So while the CNT was extremely influential, there was a big debate about how far they could go with their vision of things, and would that be imposing it on the rest of the class, let alone the rest of society. And so there's an episode that happens within the first few days in Barcelona where the CNT has defeated the fascists and black flags are flying everywhere. The collectivization has started to happen. And there's sort of a myth about it, but it points to some true dilemma where this guy called Companys, I don't know how you say it in Catalan, but he was a lawyer and a politician for the Catalan nationalist movement. And he'd actually been a lawyer for some of these anarchists when they'd gotten in trouble, so they knew each other personally. During the dictatorship, he'd represented some of the anarchists. And now he was an important politician, and his rule, he'd actually repressed them as well. But he calls in one of the main affinity groups of the FAI that had been active in the Union Defense Guards, and says to them, well, it's obvious, you all have defeated the fascists, the city is yours, I will gladly resign if that's what you want, but I'd also be willing to organize the state to continue to fight next to you, right? So he doesn't have any cards, but he's trying to come up with them. And the anarchists, the myth is that the anarchists, that affinity group says, that they hadn't thought of this ever and were faced with the anarchist dictatorship or democracy. And these were the two, sort of a famous story that's told. And so because they hadn't thought of that and they were not able to get out of that conundrum, they had to go with democracy because they didn't want any kind of dictatorship, not even an anarchist one, right? That story's not actually true. An affinity group did meet with them, and it was some of the, most influential workers of the CNT. But they didn't make any decisions at that point. They brought it back to the CNT defense groups, the defense guards of the union, and all of the delegates, and there was a long, hard discussion about what to do. And the arguments, many people, the most revolutionary CNT thought we should just dismiss these people. We should dismantle their state and create these new centers of power that we're doing with the industrial federations and the collectives that are springing up all over the rural areas. But there were strong arguments that said, no, let's wait. So much of Spain is already conquered by the fascists, and including a lot of our cadre in different parts of Spain. The British and French might arm us to help us. There's a British warship off of Spain right now. It could turn on us actually as well. And these were the kinds of pressure that were put on. So while it's really easy from now to see that it was a mistake, in my opinion, that they didn't dismiss the Republican government and just eliminate it from the scene, at the time there were real hard arguments that were being made within society and within the anarchist movement actually, that we have to be careful, we have to wait. And in that sense, people are thinking maybe we're only going to wait a few weeks until the rest of the fascist army is defeated. But that waiting period was key because what it did is it let that state reorganize itself. That had lost all its power in those first few days when the anarchist workers and socialist workers had seized power, seized what actually is power, the workplaces and the farms all over the country. And that waiting period let the state reorganize itself. It let the middle class parties reorganize themselves. It let the right wing within the UGT try and organize itself and try and orient the rest of the UGT away from the revolutionary action that was going on back towards the Republican state. So I'm skipping over a lot of stuff here, and I know I've already talked a long time. So I just want to get into what happened, because basically you have a dilemma here. You have this growing Republican government reasserting itself slowly by slowly. At the same time, you still have on the grassroots level this amazing revolution going on, wherein you have villages in Spain where people actually went so far as to abolish money and to actually practice communism. And then you have the huge amounts of industry, especially in Barcelona, being controlled by the CNT and their workers' councils. And in many places, like for instance the National Federation of Railroads, it was a UGT and CNT joint industrial federation. And that was the case in lots of places. It was a CNT/UGT organization. So it wasn't just anarchist workers, it was anarchist workers and socialist workers, and some workers that probably supported different unions on different days depending on what the argument was. So that was the dual power situation that had reasserted itself. On top of that, you also have the fascists at the front. So this isn't a situation that can stay the same. Something's going to change. And the Republican government constantly saw the CNT saw the revolution as an impediment to what they were trying to do. Of course, this is what they were being told by the British and French all the time. How can we arm you? You people are taking over industry. There's red and black flags everywhere. We're not so confident that it's a good idea to invest in the Spanish Republic. So the Spanish Republic constantly was trying to take away and restrict and confine the revolution. And unfortunately, the anarchists, because of their indecisive role about what to do, and when I say indecisive, I shouldn't say that. There was not a decisive decision by the anarchist movement to dismiss the Republican government and to try and find an alternative. There was anarchists within the movement that felt that and that argued for that, and on the grassroots level tried to carry it out in whatever situation they could. But because there was not a decisive decision about that, anarchists ended up joining the councils that were set up along with the middle class parties and the democratic capitalist parties, and those councils eventually changed into being called governments. Initially, they couldn't even call them governments because they knew the anarchists wouldn't participate in them if they called them governments. But over time they did, and they pulled the anarchists along with them into it. And as you can imagine, at least in my approach, once you get pulled into that, you start to see the world a little differently. If you're not on the front every day, or if you're not in your workplace every day, and if instead you're meeting every day with important ministers from important political parties who have important connections to Moscow or London or Washington, then your perspective starts to change. And that happened to an important section of the anarchist movement. They actually became politicians and started functioning like politicians, and their role started to be representatives of this Republican government within the anarchist movement. They had gone into it to be anarchist representatives into this broader Popular Front. Instead, they became representatives of the Popular Front inside the anarchist movement. And so this all came to a head. I should say another thing. I want to talk particularly about the counter-revolution that was going on, because that's what it was. When you talk about there being differences between the Republican state and the anarchists, it's not just like there was political differences over strategy or whatever. Those things are fine or whatever, but what it is those differences meant real things on the ground. They meant whether workers had a collective or whether a boss got brought back in. It meant whether workers had control or whether they didn't. It meant whether there was freedom of the press in the city or not. And it meant whether the workers remained armed or not. And so the thing that happened that was key to it is the Communist Party's role. And the Communist Party, because it was the most militant, it was the least fearful in some ways of the left wing of the Socialist Party and of the anarchists, it became the center for the counter-revolution. And also its links to Russia, which gave it money and resources and influence. And it became the leading call for militarizing the militias, the popular collectivized military forces that were fighting the fascists. It became the leading voice for removing the collectives from the arms industry, from returning the land to the patriotic landowners. And this all came, but it was very hard to attack the unions right off the bat because they were so strong. So it had to be this kind of continual campaign, propaganda campaign. But again, the anarchist, a wing of the anarchist movement was weakened and was letting this grow. And so it all came to a head in 1937 when the physical attacks start to happen. There have been these political attacks and these propaganda campaigns, but at this point, the police actually move against the Telefonica, if I said that right, the major telephone building in Barcelona. And when Michael said that it was seized by the CNT, it was seized, but it wasn't just seized like the day before or something. It had been seized during the revolution. It had been collectivized and run by the unions, the CNT and the UGT, although the CNT was the majority group by about 80% or something. And the workers, as you can imagine, if you're in a telephone exchange, and this is the old style, operators plugging in stuff well, the workers, of course, were listening to everything they could. Like I said, the strength of the revolution was not, some policies that were implemented, but it was that the workers themselves were rising up to be masters of their own lives. And that included, so this was a key strategic point for the Republic, and the communist-led police launched a military assault on it to clear it out and to arrest the main anarchist organizers in that workplace. But this was in central Barcelona, which was the heart of the revolution, and it was a big deal. It was basically like finally, taking off the gloves, right? And it caused a major response within the revolution. And first of all, they didn't give up the telephone exchange because those workers went to their work every day with rifles, which me and my comrades here from our call center should think about that maybe. But we work at AT&T. And
well, if you want to get the old style patch panels back in there,
yeah. So this turned into a civil war within the Civil War, where barricades went up all over Barcelona, and the CNT, and also very importantly the POUM, which was the left Marxist group, including some Trotskyists, that was critical and independent of the pro-Soviet communists, came out on the street in a major way as well. And so basically what was going on here was that for the first time since July 1936, when the rising first happened, the revolution was reasserting itself. There was a general strike. The CNT emptied out of every workplace, and of course this meant the arms weren't being produced. Everything stopped again. Barricades went up all over the city, and there was fighting between the communist police and the anarchists and socialist workers and the POUM militia. And so this was another moment where there was another chance for the revolution to assert itself, and it didn't happen, and in large part because the anarchists the politicians within the movement called on the anarchists to come off the barricades. They felt like we had proven our point. Now they understand that we're serious. They won't try and raid our workplaces again with guns. So let's come on all off the barricades. And there's good descriptions about the anarchists being on the barricades, hearing that coming over the radio, and being so upset that they shoot the radio. So they don't want to hear it. But they're also very dedicated and disciplined members of their unions, and so they do. They dismantle the barricades. And in the wake of that, there's a counter-revolutionary terror that happens, because now they've given the initiative to the counter-revolutionary forces within the Republic. And the POUM leadership, partly because they were smaller than the CNT, and partly because of their ties to Trotsky, who was was Stalin's arch nemesis from Russia, are especially targeted for assassination. But also important anarchist leaders or influential anarchists are taken out and shot, just like death squads, just like in Chile in 1973 or something like that. And then in the course of this, the revolution starts to recede. There's a military attacks on the Council of Aragon, which is a federation of rural collectives incorporating some 500,000 people, and that's dissolved militarily by the communist-led army. The militias are ordered to be militarized, that is to have professional generals put in charge of them. Women are taken off the front because real armies don't have women with arms, as you know. And so this is the death of the revolution. I've talked already too long now, so I'm going to stop it there. I have a lot more to say, but maybe we'll get into it in the question and answer.
Okay. Well, I'll just get right into it, I guess. My name is John Peterson. I'm the editor of Socialist Appeal. And I'd also like to thank Michael and Kieran for having this open, comradely exchange of ideas on this very important aspect of world history, the history of the working class. I have a personal interest in this subject. My grandfather was from Teruel in Aragon and ended the Civil War period in Valencia and ended up fleeing afterwards and ended up in Mexico. And through a very circuitous route, I ended up here. So I have some personal interest in this whole history, but obviously my main interest is political. Above all, why did it fail? Why did the Spanish Revolution fail? Leon Trotsky once said that the Spanish masses could have made 10 revolutions with the amount of energy and sacrifice that they put into it. But why didn't it succeed? In my opinion, the problem was the lack of a far-sighted revolutionary leadership. And that's the short answer. I'll get more into that a little bit later. Now, everybody has their criticisms of this or that group in the revolution. But I think we can all agree that everybody made some mistakes, some very important, some major errors. And in a lot of ways, studying the Spanish Revolution is a study of what not to do in a revolution. But the consequences of defeat, of course, were terrible. We ended up with fascism and dictatorship for decades. Ultimately, World War II was a result of the defeat of the Spanish Revolution. And the failure to learn from those mistakes also led to other things like Chile in 1973. And countless other examples where those kinds of mistakes were made. But the point isn't to point fingers at people. The point is to learn from this experience because it is relevant today, and not just in places like Venezuela, where I think there's really important parallels, but also ultimately for the revolution that we're going to see in this country in the not too distant future. So we need to learn from this accumulated experience of the working class, which we've been accumulating very painfully since at least 1848. And we don't want to repeat these mistakes too many more times. The first thing I think we need to understand is that a revolution is a process. It's not a single act. There's a lot of ups and downs. There's an ebb and flow. It's a process. It's a very complex process. And over the course of the roughly 8 years of the Spanish Revolution, you had periods of reaction, periods of advance, periods of retreat. Of course, you had, throughout this sort of constant situation of rising dual power and this conflict between the forces in the Republic and then ultimately against the forces of fascism. And in order to understand the Trotskyist position in relation to the Spanish Revolution, I think we first have to understand the character of the revolution. Now, and I think in order to understand the character of the Spanish Revolution, and in order to understand the revolutions that we're seeing, for example, in Latin America today, we have to understand Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, which basically explains that the democratic tasks of the revolution, the tasks that were accomplished, for example, in England or in France hundreds of years ago by the capitalist class, by the bourgeoisie, nowadays they can't be accomplished by the capitalist class because they've come on the scene of history too late. They're too tied to the multinational imperialists. They're too tied to the landlords, and they can't carry out these basic progressive tasks like this, distribution of the land to the peasants and things like that. And therefore, the only force in society that can resolve these tasks is the working class. But even to make those modest reforms, these basic democratic reforms, the workers and the peasants run into the limits of private property, i.e. they run into the limits of capitalism, and they therefore have to surpass the limits of bourgeois democracy, of the capitalist system, and pass on to the socialist tasks, such as nationalizing the banks, taking over the factories under workers' control, and so on. There's no such thing as a progressive bourgeoisie nowadays. I know there's a lot of people ironically enough, even in this country, think that there's a progressive wing of the capitalist class. But the fact is, the interests of the working class, the vast majority of society, and the interests of
the capitalists are 100% opposed, and you can't possibly reconcile them. It's like trying to square the circle. And that's why, in my opinion, and I think the experience of the Spanish Revolution bears out, that only the working class can lead the rest of the oppressed layers of society towards actually resolving the problems that they face. And of course, you can't build socialism in just one country, so the revolution is permanent, going back to Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, in the sense that it can't limit itself to one country, but must go become an international revolution. Now this is as compared to the theory of two stages, the two-stage theory of revolution, which says that first we'll have the sort of democratic revolution, and then we'll worry about at some point in the future about the socialist revolution. Now this kind of a theory where you believe that there is a progressive bourgeoisie, where you believe that you first have to complete this stage and then we'll worry about the next stage, the socialist stage, leads you ultimately to the formations of things like the Popular Front, like we saw in Spain, and like we saw in Chile, and like we've seen in country after country. And the Popular Front, of course, what that means, it sounds nice, maybe on paper, everybody together, but in a Popular Front, by definition, you have capitalists in this government and also the workers. But since the capitalist system is the dominant system at this stage in time, this means that you're subordinating the interests of the working class to the interests of the capitalists. And this ultimately then paralyzes the working class from being able to act in its own interests. This was a policy that was carried out basically by all the forces in Spain in the 1930s, from the socialists to the communists, the anarchists, the POUM. And ultimately what it means is that since we're in the stage of the democratic revolution, and we have to defend private property, because private property is sacred, private property is the foundation of capitalism. We can't touch that yet because that comes later. We'll worry about that later. But so mistakes in theory will lead to very important mistakes then in practice and have tragic consequences. So then to sum up, the two programs that were being proposed in Spain, the two different options that the Republic had, when, especially after Franco's uprising, was to preserve capitalist property forms and still try and defeat Franco, or to abolish private property and to conduct a revolutionary war led by the working class in order to smash fascism. Now, unfortunately, the former is what happened, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. A couple of concrete mistakes of these tactical and strategic mistakes that were made that led to even bigger problems in practice. Now, one of the tasks is in the middle of a revolution, of course, is how do you connect the ideas and program of revolutionary Marxism with the masses? How do you become a mass force? And in order to convert a small group of people, because at the beginning of this process, the Trotskyists in Spain were a very, very small group. In 1930, 1931, they were a very small group, and their task then was how can they connect their ideas, the ideas of Trotsky as against the Communist International, as against Stalinism, how could they convert that into a major force within Spain? And in order to do that, it's important to orient to the traditional organizations of the working class, where the workers are, where they're fighting, even if these organizations might be, the leadership of these organizations, as we've seen, the leadership of all these organizations were extremely reformist. They were all in favor of class collaboration, but the rank and file were extremely radicalized and looking for ideas and very willing to make tremendous sacrifices for all of this. So in 1931, Trotsky suggested to the Spanish Trotskyists, who were led by this guy named Andreu Nin, they were part of the international left opposition, or Andrés Nin, as he's called in Spanish, suggested that they orient to the Young Socialists. Now, the Young Socialists, again, the Socialist Party of Spain, which is a reformist party, the Young Socialists, it was over 100,000 young people, most of them armed, and they came asking for ideas, asking for theory, asking to get organized, asking to learn about revolutionary Marxism. Now, Nin rejected this basically on principle because the Socialist Party were the traitors of World War I, et cetera, and they wanted nothing to do with it. And what ended up happening was that the Stalinists, the Communist Party, who had a very small base actually in Spain at that time, they did take advantage of that opportunity. They ended up taking over the Young Socialists, that group, and gaining tremendous influence among these tens of thousands of armed young people in a very dynamic situation. So that was a major mistake and a major turning point, and that was as early as 1931. Another mistake, a major mistake, is if you mistake the character of the revolution. What are the tasks of the revolution? Is this a revolution to establish a kinder, gentler capitalist republic, or is it a socialist revolution? That, of course, determined the character of the war and the Civil War. Because Civil War, above all, ultimately, is an extension of the class war. It's open war between the classes. Now, a popular front, by definition, cannot wage a war against capitalism. How can a government that includes capitalists fight capitalism? Now, fascism, and because, as was explained, these folks were more afraid of the armed workers, ultimately, than they were of the fascist reaction. Now, fascism is a form of bourgeois reaction. Fascism is a form of rotting, decrepit capitalism. So how can you fight against capitalism with more capitalism? The point is that in order to fight against fascism, what was required were the methods of the working class. And what are these methods? Now, these are strikes, these are factory occupations and workers' control, the formation of workers' militias, and ultimately the formation of councils, of democratically elected committees, whether you call them Soviets, which is the Russian word for them, or juntas, which is a word that was thrown about, or whether they're factory committees that are then expanded to include other layers of the population, not just trade unionists, but the peasants and the other oppressed layers of society. Forming these, that's the ultimate tool of struggle for the working class against fascism. And ultimately, again, since this is a civil war is a social war, it's a class war, the main method for carrying out a civil war is to fight for the social transformation. In other words, not just we have to militarily defeat Franco, but in order to militarily defeat him, we have to defeat the economic base on which he rests, which is capitalism. In other words, the land needs to go to the peasants, the factories need to go to the workers, the oppressed nationalities need to be given the right to self-determination. Same goes for Morocco at that time. And there's, that was a really important aspect of all of this. But the bourgeois, the capitalist republic, did not want to do these things. And so they didn't do it. But as Trotsky explained, the peasant will not defend the landlord's land. The worker will not defend the boss's factory. They'll defend their land, their collectivized land. They'll defend their factory, but they're not going to defend, the old property relations. They're not going to sacrifice so much in order to go back to the same status quo as before. Now, instinctively, the masses tried to carry out this program. There were these massive, takeovers of landlords' land and collectivization. They were even more advanced, as was said, than in the Russian Revolution in 1917, in the beginning stages, where they collectivized the land, where factories were taken over and run under workers' control. But at every stage, they were stopped by the leadership of their organizations, whether it's the leaders of the CNT, the leaders of the POUM, and of course the leaders in the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and so on. So what was lacking in order to bring all this together, to bring all that instinctive striving of the masses to transform their lives, was a revolutionary party, like I said before, armed with a scientific worked out program and with a clear understanding of what class interests were involved in this struggle and what had to be done decisively in that situation. Now, ultimately, as was explained, the Stalinists ended up getting control. The revolution in Spain was a threat, ultimately, to the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union. They wanted to make deals with the English and the French in order to come to some kind of agreement against Hitler at this time. This was before the Hitler-Stalin Pact. They wanted to assure the Western powers that they weren't trying to make a world revolution. They cut all these deals, and they ultimately became the biggest defenders of private property and ultimately the biggest stranglers of the revolution as part of that popular front. So above all, the failure then was the failure of the workers' leadership, which was the leadership. I know we might have some disagreements about amongst folks here about whether leadership is good or bad or whatever, but the leadership existed, and the workers were looking for that leadership, and that leadership should have been elected and accountable by the workers, and then ultimately they should have had a clear program for the socialist transformation in order to wage a revolutionary war against fascism. By rejecting the struggle for power, there was the anecdote that was explained, and the conundrum that they were in, and all these pressures about do we take the power, do we not take the power, whatever. By not fighting for power, and these leaders, the leaders of the CNT, had a lot of influence. The POUM, not as much, but they were equally guilty, in my opinion, of not taking these decisive steps. They could have mobilized the workers, because if you don't contest power, if you don't fight for power, you end up leaving power in the hands of those that already have it. If you don't expand the struggle, not just to your front, the POUM and the CNT sort of looked out for their battlefront, their sort of workers, their union, their this. I mean, they all kind of isolated themselves from the broader masses. Like we said, many other workers were in other unions. Many other workers, the workers in the fascist-occupied territories, they needed to know that what they were fighting for, that they should rise up against the fascists in their lands, was because they were going to get the land, they were going to get the factories. Why should they fight against Franco if the Republic wasn't going to give them much else? And that was one of the things that the fascists would yell across, or even just the conscript troops would yell at the POUM or the anarchist troops. They'd say, well, what has the Republic done for you? During the days that the workers had basically risen up in May of 1937, when they had, as Kieran said, power in their hands, they controlled the factories, they controlled the land and everything, they had the barricades, they had the arms, who was gonna dislodge them? The only people that could have possibly dislodged them were their own leaders. And when they said, hey, can we all get along? Everybody go back to work. That was basically the last big missed opportunity in that process. Finally, I got a few things here. I just wanted to say just a couple. Do you have a few minutes? Sure, a couple minutes. Just a little bit about the POUM in particular, since we've talked about some other groups. A lot of people call them the Trotskyists, but I wouldn't call them necessarily the Trotskyists. There were Trotskyists in the POUM, but the POUM was actually the fusion of two different groups that existed in Spain, at least since the early 1930s. The communist left of Spain, which was sort of part of Trotsky's left opposition internationally, and then the workers and peasants bloc, which was actually part of the right opposition against Stalin, around people like Bukharin, for those of you that know all these names and words. So Trotsky was actually opposed to this fusion. He was opposed to because they basically both represented different viewpoints. The BOC were actually Catalan nationalists. The ICE, the people under Nin, they had rejected, like I said earlier, they'd rejected orienting to the Socialist Party in principle, and yet they were willing to fuse with this other group, which had much more important disagreements and without having a real mass base. But nonetheless, Trotsky did call the POUM the most honest organization, but it wasn't really a revolutionary Bolshevik organization. It was a centrist organization, which means that it vacillated between revolutionary Marxism and left reformism. They talked a lot about revolution in words, but in deeds they collaborated with the Popular Front. They ended up isolating themselves from the masses, and they ended up being chopped down by the GPU. Andrei Nin was captured. This leader, former personal friend of Trotsky's, was tortured and murdered and killed by the Stalinists. So ultimately, I'll sum up with this, although there's more to say. I'll just say that this centrist vacillation between reformism and revolution is what ultimately led, in my opinion, to the demise of the Spanish Revolution, because you can't make half a revolution. Just like you can't cross the road halfway. If you cross the road halfway, eventually you're going to get hit by an oncoming truck. And by not taking the revolution to its conclusion, by not disbanding the old capitalist state and building from below a workers' state and actually implementing workers' control and converting the civilian factories to arms factories in the Republican areas, which would have at that point then, if they'd gone through with this, would have been controlled by the working class. They could have had the arms. They wouldn't have had to rely on arms from the Soviet Union. They did have the potential, in my opinion, had they waged a revolutionary war to defeat fascism, and history would have been very different, as was mentioned already. So I guess I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Okay, we have lots of great questions. Let's start with the failure of leadership first, and then we'll talk about the peasant question, and then we can have an open debate about the Popular Front question. So, Jim, you want to go first?
There's a lot to talk about. Thanks to everybody for coming, first of all, for staying engaged with it. I think Scott's thing is good because it's like, it's a real thing. It's like, in the case of the anarchists, the guy that was, it's funny, he was the minister of justice, which was in charge of the prisons, right? He was an anarchist, right? But he wasn't the most right-wing anarchist, the most conservative, the most reformist anarchist. He was a guy called Garcia Oliver. I brought a book that has a list of like the affinity group he came with. One thing about the anarchists and the revolutionaries that emerged from the anarchists, almost all workers. Garcia Oliver had been a waiter, his whole life. That's what he had been when he wasn't, involved in political struggle. Not, it wasn't the intelligentsia. It was not from the bourgeoisie. It was almost all workers that made up the revolutionary leadership of the CNT. And Garcia Oliver actually had come back from that meeting with Companyias being the biggest advocate of go for broke, was how they termed it, the go for broke tendency. And he argued that in front of the CNT's, the meeting of the delegates of the different defense guards of the unions, and didn't win. And through the course of the next few months got pulled into the strategy of, well, we're going to best represent the anarchists in these defense militia, because initially it wasn't a government, it was delegates from each militia, each political representation, and that evolved into a government. And as it did, Garcia Oliver got pulled more and more into thinking of himself as a government minister, when before he'd been a militant anarchist waiter, right? And so I think it's not enough to say, well, we needed the right kind of leadership. I think we need to have a real political discussion about, well, how does revolutionary politics maintain itself? What is needed? In my view, there was a revolutionary program on the table. The CNT's program that they voted on a couple years before was for libertarian communism, was for implementing industrial federations and rural collectives and federating them together. They didn't have the audacity to carry it out. And I don't know that it's as simple as saying that the right leadership wasn't there. I think it's like a question of, how could this movement have argued to itself and to the other part of the class to go for broke? But certainly having an organized, coherent group that was for that, I'm for that. Whether that should be a party over the rest of the revolution, I'm against that conception. That's all I'll say for that right now.
Chad, do you want to talk about
Excuse me? Yeah, just briefly. Well, I mean, let's see. I think that's really the central question, that question that's being asked. So it's hard to sum up real briefly. But the point is, I do believe that it's a question of what kind of leadership was there, and a lack of clarity, a lack of a clearness of program that could connect with the masses, like I said, both in the Republic and in the areas occupied by Franco. And that audacity, I believe, would come through having confidence in your ideas, having confidence in the working class ultimately being able to make these huge changes in their own lives, which instinctively, I think, frankly, that the rank and file were 1,000 times more revolutionary than the so-called leadership. But the leadership, because of the fact that it was supposedly the leadership, did hold them back, did have, like you said, they didn't want to give up the guns, they didn't want to tear down the barricades, and yet they were disciplined. This was their leaders telling them this. So they did it, and they ended up paying dearly for it. What you have happening then is you have, as you said, not just anarchists and Pumas and so on becoming part of the Popular Front government, but you have them becoming representatives of an alien class, of the capitalist class within the workers' movement itself, a transmission belt to allow that state to reestablish itself, that capitalist state to reestablish itself by serving as the policeman ultimately of the capitalist class itself. So I do believe that carrying out audaciously that revolutionary program to expropriate the land, to collectivize the land, to take over the factories, to nationalize them, that would have won people. I mean, if you look at, for example, the American Civil War, it was really a stalemate for a long time. I mean, the Civil War, in my conception, was a confrontation between the capitalist North and the slave-owning South. Two completely different socioeconomic systems that were incompatible with each other, and then ended up coming to civil war in order to establish, to reconcile those contradictions between those two social systems. But it wasn't until Lincoln emancipated the slaves that the war actually became a revolutionary war for the transformation of the social foundations of the South, that then the North really was able to to defeat them. I mean, militarily, the North should have been able to kick the South's butt pretty easily. I mean, the economy of New York was 4 times larger than the entire South. I mean, militarily, they had the capacity. But until they took that step of actually turning it into a revolutionary war, they weren't able to carry it out. Same with Napoleon after the French Revolution. Why was Napoleon able to kick so many kings and monarchs' armies? It's because he was basing himself on bringing capitalist property forms against feudal property forms, freeing the serfs. I mean, that's a pretty powerful way to get the locals to support you. If you say, we're going to free. It wasn't because Napoleon was a good guy, but that's the property form that he based his power on, capitalist property in France, and was able to wage a war. So the same thing goes for that. If in the Republic, in the areas held by the Republic, which were the majority of Spain, Franco's forces were repelled at first. If they had carried out these measures, like I said, land to the peasants, factories to the workers, if they had freed Morocco or even just granted autonomy, the leader of the Moroccan resistance movement came to Madrid and offered to support the Republic and a lot of the troops were Moroccan, by the way. A lot of Franco's troops were Moroccan. He offered, if you will offer us autonomy, we will support you, and that would have cut a huge base of support. Same goes for offering the right of self-determination to the Basques or to the Catalans, although those were areas that were already with the Republic. But the Republic just said no, we can't do that to Morocco. Even just autonomy. And what ended up happening later on was Franco, the fascist, ended up granting freedom to Morocco later on. Why? Because he was threatened by the threat of, by the threat of revolt. But I mean, so the Republic was so cowardly in carrying out even modest social measures like autonomy for people on another continent, that they lost that potential to have that base of support that could have undermined them. So I do think it was a matter of, even if people had the best of intentions, if it isn't all brought together and linked up with a clear, conscious program, then there's a lot of confusion that reigns. And as someone who follows the Venezuelan revolution very carefully, there's a lot of parallels, like I said at the beginning, with the long, protracted, confused process that's taking place in Venezuela that we can see the tragic results of in Spain in the 1930s.
I want to address the question of the peasants because it relates actually to something John just said, and it also relates to kind of the structure of the CMT. It turns out that a lot of the anarchists had rural roots. They had families in rural areas, and they had immigrated to the cities, and they also sometimes went back to the rural areas. And so the anarchists actually had very strong roots in a large number of rural areas. Now, that wasn't geographically uniform. So there was kind of an urban-rural difference in consciousness, but there was also a difference between certain areas of Spain. So Castilla y León, which was the kind of the traditional stronghold of the Spanish state, was much less advanced because far fewer of them had actually moved to the cities than someplace like Andalusia. So you have this geographic difference, but in fact, the anarchists in particular had strong roots in a large number of rural areas. Now, but not in all rural areas. So there were areas where Franco had a strong base, especially where the anarchists didn't have a base and the Catholic Church had its traditional power. Having said that, it's also the case that the Republic did a horrible, horrible job of gaining the support of these people by essentially continuing the repressive capitalist order. So they didn't turn over land to the peasants. They crushed the rural communes. They crushed the rural general strikes. And the violence by the Republic against the peasants was really very fierce and reprehensible, especially in areas like Andalusia, where they virtually wiped out all of the anarchist cadre who had been involved in land seizures and rural communes and so on. So you have this rather failure of the political program of the Republic because they didn't want socialism, they wanted capitalism. Now, there is another issue, and this relates to the point that the gentleman in the back made, and I'm sorry I don't know your name. There was a lot of violence that took place because of century-long disagreements. So when the Republic was declared, many politically active and astute people burned down churches, tortured priests, and dug up bodies. And there was a lot of reprehensible things that happened, and this is a failure of revolutionary self-discipline and leadership. It certainly hurt the cause that they were fighting for, but I would argue, and I live in Spain, so my argument is based on just my knowledge of Spain. The people have long memories. There are people in every small town in Spain who will not talk to someone else because their grandfather was tortured by someone else's grandfather. And so there are very, very deep hatreds and animosities that go back to centuries and centuries of exploitation by the Catholic Church in conjunction with the landed capitalist class of Spain. And so when the revolution took place, this burst out. Now, having said that, the fascists did horrible, horrible things to the Republicans when they captured them, and the Republicans did horrible, horrible things to the anarchists and the Pumists who they were fighting against. So you have the war against the fascists, and then within the Republic you have the revolution and the counter-revolution. And there are many, many horrible things that everybody did, and some of them were a mistake in terms of political strategy. Just as a final aside, the current president of Spain, Jose Zapatero, Joe Shoemaker, as I like to call him, his father was executed by the fascists after being tortured. Everybody is connected to everyone else in this history of violence and oppression. So.
Yeah, I hope I'll maintain your goodwill, Peter, but I don't know what'll happen with my response. But basically, the thrust of what you're saying is like, the Popular Front was needed to defeat fascism, and my answer would be the Popular Front was incapable of defeating fascism. In fact, capitalism is not a reliable shield for people against fascism. Fascism is a threat. It was certainly a threat then. I think fascism remains a threat, but capitalism is not a sufficient shield. We can't count on that to defend us from fascism. And in fact, in my view of things, how things unfolded was, the workers were extremely aware of the threat of Franco, and that's what caused folks to jump up and to take power in their workplaces and in their farms. But once they've done that, they're not going to retreat from that, and they shouldn't retreat from that. And I think that was what gave it the strength, and that's what gave it the energy to resist Franco as much as it did. It wasn't the Popular Front parties that stopped Franco on the first few days. It was the revolutionary unions that did. And as their power receded, the fascists actually strengthened. So it wasn't as the Popular Front parties influenced in strength, the war against the fascists actually collapsed, and that's because the revolution was collapsing. And I think they're very linked. And again, it's not just a matter of there's one policy versus another. It was a matter of the police showing up at people's doors, at workplaces, at farms with guns and killing people. The Popular Front killing the revolution, literally, in many cases. And that set the stage for the much larger mass terror that happened when the fascists took power.
I want to I said I won't buy that. I'm not going to argue against what you just said.
I think Kieran raises a great question. Why the Popular Front? If the point was the theory behind the Popular Front is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If you get the socialists and the communists and the anarchists and the liberal capitalists and all these people all together, they'll make up a greater than the sum of their parts, and they'll be able to fight fascism better. But when all those disparate groups have opposing interests, or not all of them, but at least the two main poles. You got the capitalists, the so-called liberal capitalists on one side, and all the workers' organizations on the other, pulling in completely different directions. Then you don't have a force greater than the sum of its parts. You have a neutralization of all that potential force. And as they say, a spoonful of tar can ruin a barrel full of honey. And in the barrel of honey of the workers' organizations, you put this spoonful of tar. It wrecked the whole thing, frankly. So why not a united front of the workers' organizations to fight using the working class methods of struggle, which I described earlier, against the fascists? Why introduce this alien force? Now the reason is, of course, that we've been told. The reason people fell for this, we've been told for decades and decades and decades that, this is how things are. This is the sort of government we have. This is the kind of military structure we have. This is the kind of way that we wage war. But in a revolution, it's everything's turned upside down. And like I said, what was required was a revolutionary war, and not trying to replicate, not trying to fight. Like you said, you can't fight capitalism with capitalism. And we saw the examples of that in Italy and Germany and Austria and Spain, ultimately, that the so-called methods of the democracies don't work. They didn't work, and the working class paid for it. Just a couple quick points. Two is just to recommend a couple of movies to people that are kind of deal with some of these questions. Of course, the main movie in relation to Spain would be Land and Freedom, really good movie by Ken Loach, which I think people should check out. But also the movie 1900 by Bertolucci about the Italian Revolution. You see these stages, this process, the revolutionary process, the moment when the workers and the peasants and the socialists and Trotskyists and the anarchists and everybody rise up and they've got power in their hands and they don't know what to do with it. So they go back home and they turn in their guns, and then it's really tragic, and then the final line practically of the movie is the boss is back, literally, and that opportunity was wasted, and of course then we had to live through World War II as a result of that failure. So 1900 by Bertolucci, very cool movie, deals with a lot of these issues. Then just finally, if the Popular Front had won, again, what would have changed? You still would have had capitalists, you still would have had landlords, and the people just weren't willing to fight for that. And that's, I think, a really big reason for it. And just one last anecdote. Is in another movie, I guess, have you guys seen Pan's Labyrinth? That movie deals with this period of the post-Spanish Revolution. And we're told in the United States that D-Day took place because we had to fight fascism. And all these brave American farm boys went and risked their lives and died by droves in order to fight fascism. But if they were really fighting fascism and not trying to stop the advance of the Soviet Union, which is the real goal, in my opinion, why didn't, after they got into Normandy, why didn't they head west down into Spain? Why did they leave fascism in power for decades after that if they were fighting fascism? That's just another anecdote.
I want to briefly address the question. I know it's getting late. It's 8:30, and we promised that we would end by 8:30. But if you're patient, we'll stay a little longer. I just want to make 2 points. One is that the Popular Front government actually came to power in February of 1936, and the fascist uprising was in July. And the fascist uprising took place because they thought that the Popular Front was going to be easier to beat than a real revolutionary government. So the Popular Front did not come about to protect the Republic from the fascists. Okay. Simply. Now, there was a really interesting question about the tactics of the fascists. Vast majority of Franco's troops initially were Moroccan. And they were mercenaries who had been trained in guerrilla operations. They were enormously violent and cruel. They loved to torture Spaniards who had been oppressing them for a long time. And they sided with Franco because, in fact, the Republic didn't grant them colonial independence. Okay. Now, when Franco got to Spain and started with great difficulty fighting against the militias, the Union militias, he recruited a lot of people from the Catholic Church, especially rural middle-class landowners. And these people and their children formed, along with the Moroccan mercenaries, formed the backbone of the fascist troops. Now, the only reason Franco won, and by the way, this is a well-known fact in Spain, Franco was a horribly incompetent general. Okay. He was stupid. He was ultra cautious. He was generally incompetent. The only reason he won is because the Republic, the Popular Front government, was spending most of its time trying to repress the revolution. Okay. He was a horrible, horrible general. Okay. Now, having said that, essentially, the Republic lost to the fascists because, in fact, they were fighting their own people and not spending a whole lot of time fighting the fascists.
What's a little bit of an anomaly was clearly the anarchists were much stronger in Spain than almost everywhere else. There's more literature coming out about other anarchist revolutions or revolutions where there's been large anarchist influence. There's getting more out there too, and it's a richer discussion. And we could have a discussion about the Ukraine, and we probably would have a much less friendly panel up here. But I think there's a bunch of reasons, and one of them which we didn't get to, what comes to something to do with the peasants too, because in my view, there was the revolution in the countryside was as radical as the revolution in the cities. It's true that there was also a conservative force, but I think that came out of some of the collected traditions of the Spanish peasants. And I think that the way I look at working class or anarchist revolution isn't just that, the working class has been created by capitalism and has become this capitalist class, or become this revolutionary class through the mechanics of capitalism. But I look at it as people making a choice to live certain different ways. And that there was a thread of that existed in the Spanish rural traditions, that people was familiar to them and spoke to them. And so when anarchist organizers spoke that same way, they connected. And then the other thing which I'd say about us here in this country, I think we're way off in terms of being close to where the Spanish anarchists were. But obviously events can move quickly, is I think there was a real decision by anarchist organizers to orient towards the working class people. They went to work in factories, not because they wanted to support that boss, but because that's where they needed to make a living, and that's where the people were that they knew they could make revolution with. And they became, the best defenders of their coworkers. They became people that people looked to and respected. They lived, amongst the people. They didn't try and separate themselves from the people. They tried to be right in the heart of that. And I think that's something that young anarchists here need to think about, I think, and do.
Well, just briefly on the tasks in Spain versus in the U.S. versus Spain, I think what are the similarities? I think it's just very clear here. In Spain, because it was 70% peasant country, although there were really important industrial centers and a strong working class in certain areas, and although millions of the rural workers were agricultural laborers, they weren't real peasants. They didn't own any land whatsoever at all. So they had more of a working class almost psychology in some ways, even though they lived in rural areas. In this country, it's 100% clear what the tasks are. There's no question. Do we have to have a kinder, gentler democracy in the United States? That argument, carried a little weight. In Spain, where you had a monarchy up until 1931, people could say, okay, well, the next stage now must be democracy, like in France or something like that. In this country, we have the most perfect democracy that, as they say, money can buy already. So it's clear that the tasks here are socialist tasks. That is, we see the crisis of the system itself. We have the overwhelming majority of the United States are working class people, whether you work in a factory or you work at a call center or you work at, we're all workers. We sell our labor power for a wage to a capitalist. We don't live off stock actions or government bailouts. And it's clear what those tasks are. And I would say, in my opinion, that what we need is to develop that revolutionary leadership in advance, not a party above the class by any means, but part of the class. Anybody who's read the Communist Manifesto, which if you haven't read it, you should at least read so you can at least critique it from your own perspective if you don't agree with it, understands that what's argued for in there is that the communists be the most advanced sector of the working class, not something separate or apart or alien from it. And that's what I think we need to be building here. Obviously building ties with the working class in the trade unions, with unorganized workers, obviously, as well. Immigrant workers, I think that's a really important movement everybody should be involved in. But you can see the bubbling up, the simmering discontent in this country, more and more coming to the surface. And I believe it will be sooner rather than later that we will have huge opportunities in this country. And the more we prepare now, the better prepared we'll be in order to take advantage of that situation, and so that people 70 years from now, if human society even can survive that long under capitalism, they don't have a meeting at some similar bookstore talking about, what not to do in the American Revolution in the future. So,
thank you all very much for coming, and we would all be happy to stay around and continue our discussion. There is a list of books on the back of the handout that I gave you, but it's only a partial list of stuff I pulled off of my bookshelf. There are a lot of great books over there on the table as well that Mayday is interested in selling you. And thank you again also for your questions and your time.